The silence in a room full of millionaires is a specific kind of heavy. It's not quiet. It's the sound of expensive silverware clinking against bone china, the low hum of air conditioning, and the whispered deals that decide the fate of cities. I was sitting at the center of it all, in the most coveted booth at the Obsidian Room, overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan. I had just finalized the sale of my life's work, Sterling Aerosystems, for $84 million. To my left sat my daughter, Sloane, looking radiant in a dress that cost more than my first car. To my right, her husband, Vance Thorne, a man who wore charm like a rented tuxedo, shiny on the outside, but thin if you looked too closely. I excused myself to take a call in the marble-tiled lobby. It was my lead counsel, confirming the wire transfer had cleared the Swiss escrow. $84 million. I should have felt like I was walking on air. Instead, I felt a strange, cold tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my gut. As I turned to head back to the table, a hand caught my sleeve. It was a young server, a kid named Leo who I'd tipped $100 to earlier in the night just for being efficient. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was ash gray, and he was sweating despite the chill of the restaurant. "Mr. Sterling," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently I could barely hear him over the ambient jazz. I wasn't going to say anything. I could lose my job, but I saw it. I saw her. He glanced back toward my table, his eyes wide with a terror that felt too real to be anything but the truth. "When you got up, your son-in-law pointed out the chandelier to the people at the next table to distract them. And your daughter." She took a small glass vial from her clutch. "She poured a white powder into your cabinet, sir. She swirled it in." She didn't think anyone was looking. The world didn't stop, but it certainly slowed down. I felt the blood drain from my extremities, leaving me cold and hollowed out. I am 70 years old. I have navigated hostile boardrooms, survived 3 economic collapses, and built an empire from a single blueprint and a rusted-out lathe in a basement in Queens. I know how to mask my emotions. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I simply reached out, squeezed Leo's shoulder, and told him to go back to his station and say nothing to anyone. As I walked back to that table, every step felt like I was moving through waist-deep water. I looked at Sloane, my little girl, the one I'd stayed up with during every fever, the one I'd walked down the aisle only 3 years ago. Beside her, Vance was laughing, his teeth too white, his eyes too hungry. He was a venture capitalist whose only successful venture seemed to be marrying into the Sterling name. My late wife, Eleanor, had warned me. She had a way of seeing through the polished veneer of people. "Arthur," she'd said a month before the cancer took her, "that boy doesn't love Sloane. He loves the shadow you cast. He's a scavenger. Promise me you won't let him pick the bones of this family clean." I had promised. But after Eleanor died, the loneliness was a physical ache, and I had let Sloane and Vance drift closer, mistaking their presence for affection. They had been helping me more lately, ever since the news of the Aerosystems sale leaked. They wanted to help with the filing, help with the estate planning, help with the move. Vance kept suggesting I see his private physician, a man named Dr. Silas Vane, for my recent forgetfulness. Nope, I hadn't been forgetful. They had just been gaslighting me, moving my keys, canceling my appointments, making me believe my mind was slipping so they could step in as my guardians. I sat back down at the table. The wine glass sat there, a deep, murderous red. "Everything okay, Dad?" Sloane asked. Her voice was like honey, but for the first time, I heard the sting of the bee underneath. "You look a little pale. Maybe the excitement of the sale is finally hitting you?" "Just a bit of a headache, sweetheart," I said, offering her a tired, practiced smile. I looked at the glass. "You know, I think I need a bit more water before I dive back into this wine." I reached for the heavy crystal water pitcher in the center of the table. I timed it perfectly. As Vance leaned in to tell a joke about a yacht he wanted us to look at in the Hamptons, I let my hand slip. The pitcher tipped, ice and water flooding across the white linen, drenching Vance's lap and sending Sloane scrambling back to avoid the spill. It was 5 seconds of orchestrated chaos. The busboys rushed in. Vance was cursing under his breath, dabbing at his crotch with a napkin. In that blur of movement, I switched the glasses. It was a sleight of hand I'd learned in my youth to impress Eleanor, and it worked flawlessly. I sat back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I am so sorry, Vance," I said, sounding exactly like the clumsy, aging father they wanted me to be. "My hands. They just aren't what they used to be." "It's fine, Arthur," Vance snapped, his irritation bubbling through the mask of the dutiful son-in-law. He looked at Sloane, A sharp, knowing glance. "It's happening," his eyes said. "He's finally losing it." "Well?" I said, raising the clean glass, the one that had been Sloane's. "Let's not let a little water ruin the night. To family, to the future, and to getting exactly what we deserve." "To family," they echoed in unison. Sloane took a deep, confident swallow of the Cabernet. The tainted wine. I watched her. I didn't want to, but I couldn't look away. For 10 minutes, the conversation continued. Vance talked about diversifying the Sterling portfolio, which was code for him spending my money on speculative tech startups and high-stakes gambling. Sloane chimed in, but her voice was beginning to drag. She blinked, her eyelids heavy. Is it hot in here?" she murmured, rubbing her temple. "You okay, honey?" Vance asked, his brow furrowing. This wasn't in his script. "I feel heavy," Sloane said. Her words were starting to slur, the consonants softening into a mushy drone. "Dad, the lights. They're vibrating." "Sloane, you've only had half a glass," Vance said, his voice rising with a hint of genuine panic. He looked at me, then back at his wife. "Maybe you're just exhausted from the move." Sloane tried to stand up. Her chair screeched against the hardwood floor, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. She took one step, her knees buckling like wet cardboard. She didn't even have time to put her hands out to break the fall. She hit the floor with a dull, sickening thud, her head narrowly missing the edge of the table. "Sloane!" Vance screamed. He didn't move toward her immediately. His first instinct, the one that told me everything I needed to know, was to look at the wine glass. Then he looked at me. For a split second, the mask was gone. I saw the calculation, the realization, and finally, the raw, murderous fury. He knew. "Help! Someone help!" I shouted, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I fell to my knees beside my daughter, grabbing her hand. It was cold. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "My daughter! She's collapsed! Call an ambulance!" The restaurant erupted. The manager was shouting for a doctor. People were standing up, their faces pale. In the midst of the screams and the rushing feet, I leaned close to Sloane's ear. I could smell the expensive perfume I'd bought her for Christmas. "I know what you did, Sloane," I whispered, my voice a low, terrifying growl that only she could have heard if she were conscious. "And this is just the beginning of your education." I looked up at Vance. He was standing over us, his face contorted. He knew the plan had backfired, but he didn't know how deep the hole he'd dug truly went. He reached into his pocket, his hand clenching around his phone, likely trying to call his pet doctor, Silas Vane. "Don't bother, Vance," I said, my voice cracking perfectly with feigned grief as I looked at the crowd. "The waiter already called Chin Trum Muimot. They're 3 minutes out." Vance froze. A Chin Trum Muima call meant state-employed EMTs. It meant a toxicology report that wouldn't be filtered through his private doctor. It meant a paper trail. I saw the sweat break out on his upper lip. The sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, a mechanical scream cutting through the night. As the paramedics burst through the front doors of the obsidian room with their gurneys and bags, I realized this wasn't just a betrayal of money. It was a betrayal of blood. And as I watched them load my only child onto that stretcher, I knew I was no longer just a father. I was a hunter. I didn't know it yet, but the vial in Sloane's purse wasn't the only secret she was carrying that night. And what the doctors were about to find in her system would change the trajectory of my life and the Sterling legacy forever. The fluorescent lights of the Kensington Medical Center emergency wing didn't hum. They buzzed with a low-frequency vibration that felt like it was drilling directly into my skull. I sat on a rigid, molded plastic chair, hunched over, my hands clasped between my knees. To anyone passing by, I was just another elderly man waiting for bad news, a shell of a person broken by the sudden collapse of his only child. But inside, behind the mask of the grieving father, the CEO was running simulations. I was calculating variables, weighing risks, and retracing the steps that had led us to this sterile white-walled purgatory. I watched Vance out of the corner of my eye. He was pacing the length of the waiting room like a caged leopard, his expensive Italian leather loafers clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Every few seconds, he'd check his watch, then his phone, then the swinging double doors where Sloane had vanished on a gurney 10 minutes ago. He wasn't worried about Sloane's heart. He was worried about the clock. He was worried about the toxicology report that was currently being processed in a lab downstairs. I could see the sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, a small, messy crack in his otherwise perfect facade. "Arthur," he said, stopping in front of me. He lowered his voice, dropping into that practiced, empathetic tone that had fooled me for so long. You should head home. You've had a massive shock. I'll stay here. I'll handle the doctors. You shouldn't have to deal with the technicalities in your state. In your state. There it was again. The subtle jab, the gentle reminder that I was supposedly failing. I looked up at him, letting my bottom lip tremble just a fraction. I made sure my eyes looked watery and unfocused. I can't leave her, Vance. She's all I have left of Eleanor. He let out a short, frustrated breath, masking it quickly with a sigh of pity. I know, Arthur, I know. But remember what happened last Tuesday? You forgot the stove was on. You're exhausted. Let me take this burden off your shoulders. It's what family is for. I looked back down at the floor, hidden from his gaze. The stove. I hadn't left the stove on. I had found the burner glowing red when I came downstairs for a glass of water at high. Honge, but I hadn't cooked a thing that day. Vance had been the last one in the kitchen. It was a small thing back then, a senior moment. We laughed off. But looking back, it was a data point. A brick in the wall they were building around me. The truth is, Eleanor had seen the cracks in Vance Thorne long before he ever stepped foot in our home. My wife had been a woman of quiet, terrifying intuition. She was old money from the Kensington line, raised to spot a social climber from a mile away. When Sloane first brought Vance home to our estate in Greenwich, Eleanor hadn't been charmed by his stories of high-stakes venture capital or his easy, practiced smile. She had watched him the way a hawk watches a field mouse. He doesn't look at Sloane, Arthur, she had told me one night as we sat on the terrace, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. He looks at the paintings. He looks at the silverware. He looks at the way the light hits the sterling crest on the gate. He's not a partner. He's a surveyor. He's valuing the estate before we're even cold in the ground. I had laughed it off. I told her she was being cynical, that Sloane was happy, and that Vance was just ambitious. I wanted Sloane to be loved. I wanted our legacy to continue. But after Eleanor passed away 3 years ago, the house felt too large, the silences too long. When Vance and Sloane offered to move in to help me adjust, I didn't see the trap. I saw a lifeline. I welcomed the parasite into the host. Sloane changed after the funeral. My sweet, brilliant girl, who had once been so passionate about the engineering side of aerosystems, suddenly lost interest in the schematics. She started talking about lifestyle brands and social capital. She became defensive, shielding Vance from any question I asked about his business. She grew distant, as if I were a burden she was obligated to carry. I didn't know it then, but Vance was whispering in her ear every night, telling her that I was old-fashioned, that I was holding her back, that the $84 million from the sale of the company was rightfully hers to manage. The gaslighting started 6 months ago, right around the time the first rumors of the Aero Systems acquisition hit the papers. It was subtle at first. I'd lose my car keys, only to find them in the refrigerator. I'd be told I missed a dinner reservation that I never remembered making. Vance would look at me with such profound, performative sadness and say, "Arthur, we talked about this yesterday. Don't you remember?" I began to doubt my own mind. I started keeping a secret journal, hidden in the lining of my old flight jacket, documenting every interaction. I realized that the things I forgot only happened when Vance or Sloane were in the house. I was a man who had built aircraft engines that required precision down to the micron. I knew my mind wasn't failing. I knew I was being hunted. But I didn't know how far they would go until tonight, at the Obsidian Room. Vance's phone buzzed in his hand. He stepped away, his back to me, but the acoustics of the sterile hallway were a CEO's best friend. He spoke in a frantic, hushed whisper. "Vane? Yeah, it's me. Something went wrong. She took the dose. No, I don't know how." The old man spilled water. It was a mess. "Listen, I need you down here. Now. The hospital staff is running a full panel. If that powder shows up in the results, we're dead. You're her doctor on record. Get in here and take over the case before the state toxicologist gets involved." He paused, listening to the person on the other end, Dr. Silas Vane, the family physician he'd insisted I see. A man whose medical license was likely as flimsy as Vance's investment portfolio. "I don't care what it costs," Vance hissed. "The wire transfer for the $84 million is cleared. We have the capital. Just get here and fix it. Tell them she has a history of, I don't know, psychosis? Tell them she's been stealing his medication. Just make it go away." He hung up and took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing his hair back before turning to face me again. His face was back to the mask of the grieving son-in-law. But the eyes were cold, calculating, and desperate. He walked over and sat in the chair next to me, placing a heavy, unwanted hand on my shoulder. "Good news, Arthur. I just spoke to Dr. Vane. He's coming down personally. He knows Sloane's history better than anyone. He thinks this might be a reaction to some stress-related medication she's been taking. He'll clear this all up." "Is she going to be okay, Vance?" I asked, my voice small and thin. "She'll be fine, Arthur. We just need to make sure the right people are handling this. You trust me, don't you?" I looked at him, and for a fleeting second, I let the mask slip just enough for a flash of the old Arthur Sterling to peek through. "I trust you to do exactly what you've always done, Vance." He blinked, confused by the weight in my voice, but before he could question it, the double doors swung open. A doctor walked out, not the corrupt doctor, Vane, but the young resident who had taken Sloane in. He was holding a clipboard, his expression grim. "Mr. Thorne? Mr. Sterling?" the doctor asked. Vance jumped up. "Is she okay? Can we take her home?" The doctor didn't look at Vance. He looked directly at me, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "Your daughter is stable, but she's unconscious. We ran an initial screen. Mr. Sterling, are you currently prescribed any heavy-duty antipsychotics? Specifically something called olanzapine?" Vance's breath caught. I felt his hand tighten on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my muscle. This was the moment. This was the pivot point. I don't know the names of all my pills," I stammered, playing the part. "Vance handles my prescriptions. He says I can't be trusted with the bottles anymore." The doctor's gaze shifted to Vance, and the air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "Is that right, Mr. Thorne?" "Because we found a massive, near-lethal concentration of that specific drug in your wife's system. It's a medication typically used for severe schizophrenia or bipolar mania. It has a very specific side effect in healthy adults. It mimics the symptoms of a devastating stroke and causes acute, total memory loss." Vance didn't miss a beat. He let out a choked sob, covering his face with his hands. "Oh God, I knew it. I told her to stop. Arthur, I'm so sorry. She's been stealing your meds. She's been so stressed about your health, she must have snapped. She's been taking them to dull the pain of watching you fade away." It was a masterstroke of a lie. In one sentence, he had explained away the drug, blamed the victim, and reinforced the narrative that I was fading away. He was a professional. He was a monster. "We need to move her to a private facility," Vance said, his voice urgent, looking at the doctor. "My private physician is on his way. We'll handle this. It's a family matter." "Actually," the doctor said, his voice cold as ice, "given the nature of the ingestion and the dosage, we've already notified the authorities. This isn't just a medical issue anymore, Mr. Thorne. This is an investigation." Vance's face went from pale to ghostly. He looked at the exit, then at me, then at the doctor. The walls were closing in, but he was still looking for a way to climb over them. "I need to call my lawyer," Vance whispered, his charm finally, completely evaporated. As he stepped away to make the call, I sat back in my plastic chair. I felt a strange sense of calm. The game was no longer being played in the dark. The pieces were on the board. Vance thought he was protecting himself, but he didn't realize that I had spent the last 3 months doing more than just writing in a journal. I didn't know it yet, but the Tarmoy Bordeaux La Million wasn't the only thing Vance was trying to steal. He was hiding something much darker in the books of Sterling Aero Systems, something that involved the very shipping routes I had built my empire on. And the private facility he wanted to move Sloane to? It wasn't a hospital, it was a prison. What Vance didn't know was that I had already made a call of my own while he was checking on the car earlier that evening. And the man who was currently parked across the street from the hospital wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. He was a specialist in a very different kind of acquisition. Vance turned back to me, his eyes narrow and dangerous. "Arthur, we're leaving, now. Before the police get here. We'll take Sloane, and we'll go to the estate. We'll handle this ourselves." I looked at my son-in-law, the man who had tried to erase my mind, and I smiled. It wasn't a senile smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to burn everything down just to see the look on the arsonist's face. "I don't think so, Vance," I said, my voice finally, terrifyingly steady. "I think we're going to stay right here and wait for the truth to come out. Don't you?" The look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face was the best $84 million I'd ever spent. But as the hospital doors hissed open and a tall man in a dark suit walked in, I realized the betrayal went even deeper than I imagined, because the man wasn't there for me. He walked straight up to Vance and handed him a sealed envelope. "The papers are ready, Mr. Thorne," the man said. "The emergency conservatorship has been filed. You now have full legal control over Arthur Sterling." The trap had just snapped shut, and I was on the wrong side of it. The man in the dark suit didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a funeral director, cold and efficient, handing over the document that effectively signed my life away. Vance took the envelope with a slow, reverent hand, his fingers tracing the embossed seal of the county court. The transformation in him was instantaneous. The frantic, sweating mess from moments ago vanished, replaced by a terrifying, cold-blooded composure. He didn't just stand taller, he seemed to expand, filling the sterile hallway with a predatory dominance. He looked at the papers, then looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't bother to hide the contempt in his eyes. There was no more Arthur, no more Dad. I was just an asset to be managed, a problem that had finally been solved. He tucked the envelope into his inner suit pocket, patting it twice as if to ensure my soul was securely trapped inside. "The court has spoken, Arthur," Vance said, his voice dropping into a smooth, authoritative baritone. "Given your recent history of cognitive decline and tonight's unfortunate incident with the water pitcher and your daughter's collapse, Judge Blackwood felt it was in everyone's best interest to fast-track the petition. I am now your legal guardian. Every decision, every penny, every breath you take it goes through me." I sat there, frozen in my plastic chair, playing the part of the stunned, broken old man. But inside, my mind was screaming. Judge Blackwood? I knew that name. He was a regular at the Harrison Club, a man whose gambling debts were rumored to be as vast as his ego. Vance had clearly been busy over the last few months, buying the very pillars of the justice system while I was busy mourning Eleanor. You can't do this, Vance," I stammered, making my voice thin and reedy. "I built Sterling Aero Systems. I'm the one who made that $84 million. You can't just take it." Vance chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "I'm not taking it, Arthur. I'm protecting it. From you, from your confusion, from your mistakes. You're lucky you have a son-in-law who cares enough to step in." He turned to the man in the dark suit. "Make sure the security detail is moved to the estate. I want the gates locked. No visitors. No phone calls. And get Dr. Vane down here. We need to finalize the medical certification for the long-term facility." As they spoke, my mind drifted back to the first time I should have seen the truth. It was 2 years ago, during the grand opening of our new high-precision turbine hangar in Connecticut. Sloan had been the one to cut the ribbon, looking every bit the Harris to the Sterling legacy. But later that night, I'd walked into the observation deck and found Vance huddled in the corner with a man I didn't recognize, a rough-looking character with a jagged scar across his knuckles. They were looking at the shipping manifests for our European routes. At the time, I thought Vance was just showing initiative, learning the logistics of the company. I remember him jumping when he saw me, his smile snapping into place like a trap. "Just looking at the efficiencies, Arthur," he'd said. "We could be moving twice as much volume through the Rotterdam port if we streamlined the Green Lane protocols." The Green Lane was our pride of fast-track customs clearance we'd earned over 30 years of flawless, high-security transport of aerospace components. I had trusted him. I had given him the keys to the kingdom because I wanted to believe my daughter had chosen a man of substance. I didn't realize he wasn't looking at turbines. He was looking at a back door into the international market for things that didn't belong on an airplane. I looked at Sloan through the window of the ICU. She was still unconscious, her face pale against the white pillows. My heart ached, a deep, dull throb of grief. How had I lost her? She had been my shadow in the workshop when she was 5, her small hands covered in grease as she handed me wrenches. She used to say she wanted to build a plane that could fly to the moon. Now, she was a co-conspirator in her father's destruction. Was she a victim of Vance's manipulation, or had the hunger for the $84 million been in her all along, a dormant seed that only needed the right darkness to grow? The powder she had poured into my wine was a clinical betrayal. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the erasure. They didn't want me dead. Death is messy. Death triggers audits and probate. They wanted me gone while I was still breathing. A living ghost, haunting my own halls while they spent my life's work. The double doors at the end of the hall hissed open, and a man walked in who looked like he'd been carved out of ice. Dr. Silas Vane. He was tall, thin, and wore a white coat that was far too pristine for an ER. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a specimen under a microscope. He didn't go to the nurse's station. He went straight to Vance. "The paperwork is in order?" Vane asked, his voice a cold, precise rasp. "Everything is signed," Vance replied, tapping his chest where the envelope lay. "He's mine now, Silas, but but we have a problem. Sloane took the dose. She's in the ICU. Vane's eyes flickered toward me for a microsecond, a flash of something that might have been annoyance, before returning to Vance. A complication, but it doesn't change the diagnosis for the father. If anything, her collapse from the stress of his erratic behavior only strengthens our case. I'll go in and assess her. I'll make sure the toxicology report is adjusted to reflect a suicide attempt brought on by the trauma of her father's decline. My blood ran cold. They were going to frame my daughter's accidental poisoning as a suicide attempt just to bury me deeper. They were a team, a lawyer, a doctor, and a scavenger tearing at the carcass of a family that wasn't even dead yet. "Arthur," Vance said, turning back to me, his voice now filled with a fake, oily kindness that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Vane is here. He's going to give you something to help you sleep. You've had such a long, confusing night. You need to rest." "I don't want to sleep, Vance," I said, making sure my hand shook as I reached for my water cup. "I want to talk to Sloane. I want to tell her I'm sorry." "You'll have plenty of time for apologies later," Vane said, stepping toward me. He reached into his black medical bag and pulled out a pre-filled syringe. The light caught the needle, a wicked, silver glint that promised a darkness I might never wake up from. "This is just a mild sedative, Mr. Sterling, to help with the agitation." I looked around the waiting room. The young resident who had been suspicious earlier was gone, replaced by a nurse who was busy at the far end of the hall. The man in the dark suit stood by the exit, blocking my path. I was 70 years old, outnumbered, and legally erased. But what Vance Thorne didn't know was that while I was forgetting my keys and missing my appointments over the last few months, I had been doing more than just keeping a journal. I had reached out to an old friend from my days in the Air Force, a man who specialized in invisible assets. I had spent $3 million of my own secret offshore accounts to build a failsafe that Vance's lawyers couldn't touch. I looked at the needle as Vane moved closer. I could smell the antiseptic on his skin. "Wait," I whispered, shrinking back into the chair. I need to tell you something first, about the shipping manifests. The ones in the safe at the estate." Vance froze. His eyes narrowed, the greed winning out over the desire to drug me into silence. "The safe? What about them, Arthur?" "There's a second set," I lied, my voice trembling perfectly. "The ones with the real cargo lists, the ones for the special logistics account. If anything happens to me, if I don't sign the weekly release, they get sent automatically to the Federal Aviation Authority. It's a dead man's switch." Vance's face went from smug to murderous in a heartbeat. He stepped into my personal space, his breath hot on my face. "You're lying. You're too senile to set up a dead man's switch." "Maybe," I said, a tiny spark of the real Arthur Sterling flashing in my eyes. "But are you willing to bet $84 million and your freedom on that?" "If I sleep now, Vance." The clock starts ticking. Vance looked at Dr. Vane. The doctor held the needle poised, waiting for the command. The silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic beeping of the monitors from the room where my daughter lay dying. "Check the house," Vance hissed to the man in the dark suit. "Go to the study. Find that safe. If he's lying, we bury him tonight. If he's telling the truth." He looked back at me, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. "Then we'll just have to find a way to make him sign that release before he loses his mind entirely." Vance leaned in closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "You think you're smart, Arthur? You think you can outrun me? You're just a dinosaur waiting for the asteroid. And I'm the asteroid." He signaled for the man in the dark suit to leave. Then he turned to Vane. "Keep him awake for now, but keep him here. I'm going to go see my wife. I need to make sure she remembers exactly what to say when she wakes up." Vance walked toward Sloane's room, leaving me alone with the ice-cold Dr. Vane. The doctor didn't put the needle away. He just stood there, watching me with those dead eyes. I looked down at my hands. I had bought myself a few hours, maybe a day. But the dead man's switch wasn't a lie. It just wasn't in the safe. It was currently sitting in a small, nondescript office in Brooklyn, held by a man who was waiting for a text message I hadn't sent yet. What I hadn't told Vance, what I couldn't tell anyone, was that the special logistics he was so worried about wasn't just about smuggling. It was about a hidden debt Eleanor had left behind, a secret that would destroy the Sterling name more effectively than any scandal. And as the sun began to peek over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, bloody shadows across the hospital floor, I realized that to save my life, I might have to destroy the very legacy I had spent 40 years building. I didn't know it yet, but the man Vance had sent to my house wasn't just going to find an empty safe. He was going to find something that would make him realize that Vance Thorne wasn't the only one who knew how to play a long, dirty game. The double doors opened again, and a nurse rushed out of Sloane's room. "Doctor, she's crashing." Her heart rate is skyrocketing. It's a neurological storm. Vane didn't move toward her. He looked at me, then at the needle, and I saw a terrifying thought cross his mind. If Sloane died, the 84 million would be easier to take, and I was the only witness left. The flat, piercing whine of the heart monitor cut through the sterile air like a serrated blade. It's a sound that haunts your nightmares, the sound of a life trying to exit through a digital exit sign. Nurses scrambled, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking frantically against the linoleum, a chaotic percussion to the high-pitched drone of the alarm. I watched through the glass, my chest tightening with a grief that was raw and terrifyingly real. Regardless of the powder she'd poured, regardless of the betrayal that sat like lead in my stomach, she was still my Sloane. She was the girl I'd taught to ride a bike on the driveway of the Kensington estate, the girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read her stories about the stars. I saw Dr. Vane move toward the room, but he wasn't rushing. He adjusted his glasses, his pace methodical, almost leisurely. He wasn't a healer. He was a mortician in a living man's clothing. He paused at the door, catching Vance's eye. A look passed between them, a silent, ghoulish calculation. Vance didn't look like a husband watching his wife die. He looked like a man checking the tracking number on a package. He wasn't praying for her heart to start. He was weighing the pros and cons of a funeral versus a long-term care facility. "Vance," I wheezed, grabbing his sleeve, my voice a broken rasp. "Do something. Help her. Why aren't they doing more?" Vance looked down at my hand on his expensive wool sleeve as if I were a smudge of dirt. He didn't shake me off. He simply stood still, let the silence hang for a heartbeat, and then leaned in. The mask didn't just slip. He took it off and threw it away. "You should be careful what you wish for, Arthur," he whispered, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "If she dies, this becomes much simpler. The conservatorship remains. The 84 million becomes mine by right of inheritance. No messy divorce, no explanations to Sloane when she wakes up about why her father is in a padded cell. If her heart stops, your life ends too, just in a different way." I recoiled, my back hitting the cold wall. I let my jaw slacken, my eyes darting around as if I were lost in a fog of dementia, but inside, I was memorizing every syllable. He was admitting it. He was ready to let her go for the payout. The neurological storm the nurse had mentioned was a violent reaction to the olanzapine. It was a drug meant to stabilize the shattered minds of the institutionalized, but in a healthy person, it was a chemical wrecking ball. It had been meant for me. It had been meant to make me look erratic, to make my speech slurred and my memory a sieve so that Judge Blackwood could sign those papers with a clear conscience. Now, it was tearing through Sloane's nervous system. Vane entered the room and began barking orders, but they were strange, counterintuitive. I've spent 40 years around engineers and scientists. I know when a process is being sabotaged. He was calling for medications that would suppress her respiratory drive, not stabilize her heart. He was cleaning up the evidence by ensuring the patient couldn't testify. "I need to see her," I cried out, making a move toward the door. Vance stepped in front of me, his hand a solid wall against my chest. "You're agitated, Arthur. The doctor said you're a danger to the clinical environment. Sit down." He signaled to the man in the dark suit, the one he called Silas's assistant, though he looked more like a debt collector for the underworld. The man grabbed my arms, not roughly, but with a terrifying, inescapable strength, and forced me back into the plastic chair. I didn't fight him. I let my body go limp, playing the part of the defeated patriarch. "Is the man at the estate?" Vance asked, ignoring my feigned whimpering. He was talking to the assistant. "He's in the study now," the man replied, his voice a low grunt. "He's working on the safe. He said the encryption is old-school Sterling. It'll take him 20 minutes. Vance nodded, a dark satisfaction blooming on his face. "Tell him to look for the special logistics files. And if he finds anything regarding the Orion Group, tell him to burn it on site. We can't have the feds tracing the Rotterdam shipments back to the estate." The Orion Group. The name hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't heard that name in 20 years. They were a shadowy syndicate, a collection of high-end smugglers and corporate raiders who had tried to infiltrate Sterling Aerosystems back in the 90s. I had fought them off, nearly losing the company in the process. I thought they were gone, buried under a mountain of lawsuits and federal indictments. But Vance wasn't just a scavenger. He was an asset. He had been planted in my daughter's life by the very ghosts I thought I'd exorcised. He wasn't just after the 84 million. He was after the Green Lane shipping routes. He wanted to turn my aerospace logistics empire into a highway for the Orion Group's black market cargo. The company sale wasn't an exit strategy for him. It was a way to wash the money and disappear into the corporate structure of the buyer, leaving me to rot as the insane founder who would be blamed for any discrepancies the auditors found. You're with them, I whispered, making sure I sounded terrified. The men from the shadows. Eleanor saw you. She saw the darkness. Vance laughed. And this time it wasn't the polished laugh of a son-in-law. It was the jagged, cruel sound of a predator who had already tasted blood. Eleanor was a smart woman, Arthur. Too smart for her own good. It's a shame her cancer was so aggressive. Or maybe it wasn't a shame at all. Maybe it was just timely. My heart stopped. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. I looked at him, and for a second, I forgot to play the part. My hands balled into fists, the strength of 40 years of hard work surging into my forearms. Eleanor. They hadn't just waited for her to die. They had accelerated it. You monster, I breathed. I'm a businessman, Arthur, Vance said, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. And business is about to conclude. As soon as my man finds those files, you're going to a very quiet place in upstate New York. A place where the walls are thick and the doctors are very, very well paid to make sure you never have a lucid moment again. And as for Sloan, he glanced toward the room where the monitors had finally settled into a low, steady throb. If she survives, she'll be told you attacked her. She'll hate you until the day you die, which, I imagine, won't be very long from now. He turned away, pulling out his phone to check the wire transfer status. I sat there, the weight of his revelation pressing down on me. They had killed my wife, they were killing my daughter, and they were currently in my home, trying to steal the evidence of their own crimes. But Vance had made a fatal mistake. He assumed that because I was 70, I was obsolete. He assumed that because he had a lawyer and a doctor, he had the winning hand. He didn't realize that the man he had sent to my estate wasn't alone. I reached into my pocket and touched the small, cold coin I'd been carrying. It wasn't a coin. It was a transmitter. I pressed it 3 times. A signal, silent and invisible, raced through the airwaves toward the Greenwich estate. Suddenly, Vance's phone rang. He snapped it up, expecting the all-clear from his man in my study. Yeah? You got it? Vance asked, his voice eager. There was a pause. Vance's expression shifted from smugness to confusion, and then to a pale, flickering fear. What do you mean the safe is empty? Vance hissed. Check behind the wood paneling. It has to be there. Another pause. Vance's hand began to shake. Who? Who is there? Put him on the phone. Vance listened for a long moment, his face turning a shade of white that matched the hospital walls. He slowly lowered the phone, looking at me as if I had suddenly turned into a serpent. Arthur, he whispered, his voice trembling. Who is Julian Vane? I sat up straight. The tremors in my hands vanished. The watery, unfocused look in my eyes cleared, replaced by a cold, predatory intelligence that hadn't been seen since I launched my first turbine. Julian is the man you should have researched before you decided to play at being a sterling, Vance, I said, my voice resonating with a power that made the man in the dark suit take an involuntary step back. He's Silas's brother, the one Silas hasn't spoken to in 15 years, the one who spent 10 years in special ops and another 5 as my head of private security. I stood up, and for the first time that night, I looked taller than him. Julian isn't a doctor, Vance. He's a reaper. And right now, he's sitting in my study with your man's head on my desk, looking at the real shipping manifests. The ones that prove you've been using Sterling Aero Systems to move Orion Group contraband for the last 18 months. Vance lunged for me, his face contorted in a silent scream of rage. But I didn't flinch. The man in the dark suit moved to intervene, but he was stopped by a new sound. The elevators at the end of the hall chimed. The doors slid open, and 4 men in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow across the back stepped out. They weren't moving slowly. They were moving with the grim, unstoppable purpose of a federal hammer. Vance Thorne? The lead agent shouted, his weapon drawn but held at his side. Federal agents. Hands where we can see them. Vance froze, his hand halfway to my throat. He looked at the agents, then at me, then at the room where Sloan lay. He was trapped. He was done. But as the agents tackled him to the floor, pinning him against the very linoleum he'd paced so confidently, I saw Dr. Silas Vane slip out of Sloan's room. He didn't look at his brother's employer. He didn't look at the feds. He moved toward the back stairwell with a speed that suggested he had an exit strategy of his own. And that was when I realized the dead man's switch wasn't just about the files. "Wait," I shouted to the agents, pointing at the disappearing doctor. "He has the antidote. If he leaves with that syringe, my daughter dies." The chase was on. But as I rushed toward Sloane's room, my heart hammering, I didn't know that Silas Vane had one final, devastating card to play. A card that would force me to choose between my daughter's life and the $84 million that was currently sitting in a digital limbo, waiting for a final, irrevocable authorization. I burst into the room. Sloane's monitor began to scream again. A long, flat line. "She's flatlining," a nurse yelled. I looked at the empty doorway where the doctor had been. I looked at my daughter. And then I looked at the tablet sitting on the bedside table, glowing with the notification. Authorization required. Wire transfer. Finalization. The clock wasn't just ticking for the company. It was ticking for her heart. The flat, agonizing scream of the heart monitor felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. It was a single, unyielding note, the sound of a life surrendering. Nurses were a blur of blue scrubs and white sneakers, their voices sharp and urgent, barking out numbers and drug names that sounded like a foreign language. I stood at the foot of the bed, frozen, my eyes locked on Sloane's face. She looked so small amidst the forest of tubes and wires. This was the girl who had once believed I could fix anything with a wrench and a bit of grease. Now, I was a billionaire with $84 million in a digital vault, and I couldn't even make her heart beat. The tablet on the bedside table pulsed with a soft, rhythmic blue light. It was a grotesque contrast to the jagged red lines of the medical monitors. Authorization required. One thumbprint. One digital signature. That was all it would take to finalize the sale of Sterling Aero Systems. Vance had set it up this way, a final, cruel failsafe. He knew that in the chaos of a medical emergency, I might be desperate enough to trade the company for a chance at saving her. He didn't just want my mind. He wanted my legacy, and he was willing to use my daughter's dying breath as the ink for the contract. I looked at the doorway. Doctor Silas Vane had vanished into the shadows of the back stairwell. The FBI agents were still pinned down in the hallway, struggling with Vance and his assistant. They didn't know about the syringe. They didn't know that the man they thought was a doctor had just walked out with the only thing that could stop the neurological storm raging inside Sloane's brain. "I have to go," I whispered to no one. "Sir, you can't be in here," a nurse shouted, her hands busy with the defibrillator paddles. Clear. The thud of the electricity hitting Sloane's chest made her body jump, a violent, artificial imitation of life. I didn't stay to see if it worked. I turned and ran. My 70-year-old joint screamed in protest, a sharp, stabbing pain radiating through my hips and knees, but I didn't feel it. I was fueled by a cold, concentrated rage that had been brewing since the moment Leo the waiter had stopped me in the lobby of the Obsidian Room. I burst into the stairwell. The air was colder here, smelling of damp concrete and industrial cleaner. I heard the frantic, echoing rhythm of footsteps descending quickly 3 floors below, maybe 4. Silas Vane was fast, but he was carrying the weight of his own panic. I didn't follow him down. I knew this hospital. I'd funded the wing that housed the surgical suites 2 years ago. I knew that the back stairs led to a service corridor that exited near the oxygen farm, a maze of pipes and tanks that was a graveyard for anyone who didn't know the layout. I took the elevator. It felt like an eternity, the slow, mechanical crawl of the floor numbers ticking down. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I didn't head for the main exit. I ducked into a maintenance closet, grabbed a heavy iron pipe used for propping open the loading bay doors, and slipped out into the fog-heavy night air of the hospital's rear courtyard. I saw him. Silas Vane was fumbling with the keypad of a black sedan, parked near the liquid oxygen tanks. He looked frantic, his pristine white coat now stained with grease and sweat. He was holding a small, insulated medical pouch, the kind used for transporting sensitive biological samples. That was it. The antidote wasn't a standard hospital drug. It was likely a proprietary compound the Orion Group used to manage their assets, a chemical leash that only they held the collar to. "Silas," I bellowed. My voice didn't sound like a confused old man's. It sounded like the roar of a furnace. He spun around, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the pouch, clutching it to his chest like a holy relic. "Arthur? How? You should be in the ICU. You're a sick man. I'm the man who's going to watch you crawl," I said, stepping into the dim pool of light cast by the security lamps. I raised the iron pipe. I wasn't a brawler, but I had spent 40 years in machine shops. I knew how to strike for maximum impact. "Give me the pouch, Silas." Give it to me, and maybe I don't tell the FBI about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that Julian found in your brother's safe." Silas let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "Julian? That traitor. He always did have a soft spot for your money, Arthur. But you're too late." The dose Sloane took. It's not just olanzapine. It was spiked with a neuroinhibitor developed by the Orion Labs. Without this stabilizer, her brain will literally cook itself. The flatline was just the beginning. Even if they get her heart started, she'll be a vegetable by dawn. He backed away toward the car, his hand on the door handle. "You want her back? Then authorize the transfer." "Vance told me the tablet was left in the room for a reason. Sign the company over to the Orion shell, and I'll leave the pouch on the dashboard. It's a simple trade. The sterling name for the sterling daughter." My hand tightened on the pipe. The $84 million. The company I'd built from a single rusted lathe. The Green Lane shipping routes that were now being used to move poison across borders. If I signed that transfer, I was handing a loaded gun to the monsters who had killed my wife. I was legitimizing the Orion Group. But if I didn't, I was signing Sloane's death warrant. "You think I care about the money?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've had money my whole life, Silas. It never kept me warm. It never brought Eleanor back." "Then sign it," Silas hissed. "Sign it, and save your daughter." "There's a third option," I said. I didn't swing the pipe at him. I swung it at the car. The heavy iron smashed into the driver's side window, glass exploding in a glittering spray. Silas screamed, dropping the pouch as he dove for cover. Before he could recover, I was on him. I didn't act like a gentleman. I grabbed him by the throat and slammed his head against the doorframe of the sedan. The sound of his skull hitting the metal was a dull, sickening thud. He slumped to the ground, dazed. I grabbed the pouch, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. But as I zipped it open, my blood turned to ice. Inside weren't just vials. There was a small, handheld computer, a decryption device. "What is this?" I grabbed Silas by the lapels, shaking him. "Where is the medicine?" Silas looked up at me, a thin trail of blood running from his nose. He smiled, a bloody, crooked grin. "There is no medicine, Arthur. The neurological storm. It's self-correcting. The olanzapine wears off in 6 hours. The flatline? That was just a localized cardiac event caused by the shock of the seizure. The antidote was a lie Vance made up to keep you in the room, to keep you focused on the cure while he finalized the transfer from his phone." I froze. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The chase, the syringe, the storm. It was all a diversion. While I was out here playing hero in the dark, Vance Thorne was in the hallway, likely using a secondary device to bypass my authorization now that I had fled the scene and proved my instability. "He's finishing the transfer right now," Silas wheezed. "By the time the FBI gets him to the station, the money will be in the Orion accounts, and you'll be a fugitive who attacked a doctor. Vance doesn't need Sloane alive, Arthur. He just needed you out of the way." I didn't waste another second on him. I grabbed the pouch and the decryption device and ran back toward the hospital entrance. My mind was racing. If Vance was finalizing the transfer, he was using the Sterling mainframe. And there was only one person who had the backdoor access to that mainframe besides me. I pulled out my phone as I ran. "Julian, are you still at the estate?" "I'm here, Arthur." Julian's voice came through, calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I've got Vance's man tied to a chair in the basement. What's the status?" "Vance is bypassing the authorization," I shouted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's using a ghost protocol. He's going to dump the 84 million into the Orion shell. You have to kill the servers, Julian, now." "I can't kill them from here, Arthur," Julian said, and I could hear the grim realization in his voice. "The sale went through a triple-blind escrow. The only way to stop the transfer is to trigger a manual hard reset at the source, the physical server room at Sterling Aerosystems. That's 20 miles away," I said, glancing at the black sedan with the smashed window. "I'm already in the car," Julian said. "But Arthur, if I reset those servers, the entire company valuation drops to zero. The acquisition will be voided. You won't just lose the 84 million. You'll lose everything. The patents, the property, the legacy. You'll be bankrupt by morning." I looked up at the 4th floor of the hospital. The lights were still flickering, the emergency team still working. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the rusted lathe in the basement. I thought about the daughter who had tried to drug me because she thought the money was more important than her father. "Burn it," I said. "Arthur, burn it all." "Julian," I commanded, my voice like iron. I'd rather be a pauper with my soul intact than a billionaire with Vance Thorne's hand in my pocket. Reset the servers. Shut it down. I hung up. I stood in the middle of the courtyard, the cold fog swirling around my ankles. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. For 40 years, the company had been my life. It had been my identity. And in one sentence, I had erased it. I walked back into the hospital, past the security guards who were now looking for Silas Vane, and took the elevator back to the 4th floor. When I stepped out, the hallway was strangely quiet. The FBI agents were gone. Vance was gone. I walked into Sloane's room. The heart monitor was beeping again, a slow, steady, fragile rhythm. She was alive. A nurse was adjusting her her face tired but relieved. "She's back, Mr. Sterling," the nurse said softly. It was a miracle. Her heart just started again. "She's in a deep sleep, but the vitals are stabilizing." I sat down in the chair by her bed. I looked at the tablet on the table. The screen was dark. The blue light was gone. The transfer had failed. I reached out and took Sloane's hand. It was warm now. I sat there for hours, watching her breathe, waiting for the sun to rise on a world where I owned nothing but the truth. But as the first light of dawn hit the Manhattan skyline, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you won, Arthur? Check the news. Vance isn't the only one who wanted Sterling Aero Systems, and we don't need a server to take what's ours." I looked out the window. Down in the street, 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the hospital entrance. These weren't FBI. These were men in gray suits, carrying briefcases that looked like weapons. I didn't know it yet, but the Tarmoy Born Dola Million was just the tip of an iceberg that was about to sink the entire city. And the man leading the gray-suited army into the lobby was someone I hadn't seen in 30 years, the man I thought I had killed in Rotterdam. The dawn didn't bring light. It brought a cold, gray clarity that made the world look like a charcoal sketch. I stood by the window of Sloane's room, my breath fogging the glass, watching those 3 black SUVs idle in the hospital's circular drive. The men in the gray suits didn't look like federal agents. They didn't have the hurried, bureaucratic energy of the FBI. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace, the kind you only see in private security details for people who don't exist on paper. At the head of the group was a man I hadn't seen in 30 years. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a rainy night on the docks of Rotterdam in Mutngin Chintrum Chinwe Sar, where I'd left him for dead after he tried to hijack my first international shipping contract. Merrick Vance. He was older now, his hair a shock of silver, but his eyes were the same cold, pale discs that saw people only as obstacles or assets. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Merrick wasn't just a scavenger like his namesake son-in-law. He was the architect of the Orion Group. I looked back at Sloane. She was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, fragile cadence. I had burned my life's work to save her. I had destroyed the servers, erased the patents, and rendered the $84 million into digital ash. I was effectively bankrupt. But looking at the men entering the lobby below, I realized I hadn't just destroyed a company. I'd declared war on a ghost. The door to the room hissed open. It wasn't a nurse. It was Merrick. He walked in alone, his gray suit perfectly tailored, his presence filling the small room until the walls felt like they were closing in. He didn't look at the monitors or the tubes. He looked at me, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. "Arthur," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. Burning the servers? That's a move from the old school. A bit scorched earth, don't you think?" "I thought you were dead, Merrick," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart against my ribs. I should have checked the pulse myself. "You were always too sentimental, Arthur. That's why Eleanor liked you. It's also why she came to me when she realized you couldn't protect the legacy on your own." The air left my lungs. I felt like I'd been kicked in the sternum. "What are you talking about?" Merrick walked over to the bedside table and picked up the tablet, the one that was now a useless piece of glass. "Eleanor knew about Rotterdam. She knew about the special logistics and the blood that was baked into the foundation of Sterling Aero Systems. She didn't want our little girl to inherit a lie. So, 20 years ago, she made a deal. She paid me a retainer, a very large, very secret retainer, to stay in the shadows and ensure that when the time came, the company would be transitioned back into Orion hands. Gently, without the feds noticing. "You're lying," I hissed, stepping toward him. "Eleanor loved this family. She would never deal with a monster like you." Merrick reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a weathered, yellowed envelope. He tossed it onto the bed. "Read it, Arthur. It's her handwriting." She didn't trust you to make the hard choices. She knew you'd cling to the Green Lane status until it choked you. Vance Thorne wasn't just a social climber. He was the delivery boy. He was meant to facilitate the transfer so you could retire in peace, blissfully unaware of the rot underneath. I picked up the envelope. The paper felt like lead. I recognized the stationery, the heavy, cream-colored stock Eleanor used for her private correspondence. I opened it, my hands shaking. Arthur, forgive me. Some secrets are too heavy for one man to carry. The Orion debt must be paid, or it will consume us both. The world tilted. My entire reality, the 40 years of struggle, the clean empire I thought I'd built, was a facade. I wasn't the hero of this story. I was the mark. My wife had been protecting me from a debt I didn't even know I owed, and my daughter had been groomed to be the final payment. The hard reset you triggered? It didn't stop us, Arthur, Merrick said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It just made the acquisition cheaper. We don't need the digital patents. We have the physical tooling. We have the warehouses. And thanks to the conservatorship papers Vance filed, which are still very much legal, we have the right to liquidate everything to satisfy the creditors I've just manufactured. Vance is in custody, I reminded him. The FBI has him. Vance is a foot soldier. He'll be out on bail by lunch, and his testimony will be that he was trying to stop you from destroying the company in a fit of dementia. And look at you, Arthur. You're broke. You're agitated. You've just cost thousands of employees their livelihoods by shutting down the servers. Who do you think the judge is going to believe? He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive tobacco and mint. I'm taking the estate, Arthur. I'm taking the hangar in Connecticut, and I'm taking the girl. Sloane is coming with me to a private recovery wing where she'll be told exactly what her father did to her. By the time she wakes up, you'll be a ward of the state, rotting in a government-funded bed in the Bronx. I looked at Sloane, and a wave of pure, unadulterated failure washed over me. I had hit rock bottom. I had no money, no company, and the memory of my wife was now tainted by a betrayal I couldn't even ask her about. I felt 70 years old. I felt tired. I felt like giving up. Merrick signaled to the door. Two of the gray-suited men entered. Mr. Sterling is leaving now, Merrick commanded. He's no longer authorized to be in this wing. His conservatorship has been transferred to an Orion-affiliated trust. The men grabbed my arms. I didn't fight them. I couldn't. I was a man who had lost his North Star. As they dragged me toward the door, I looked at Sloane one last time. Her eyes flickered, just for a second. A tiny, minute movement beneath the lids. Wait, I croaked. Get him out, Merrick said, not even looking back as he sat in the chair I'd occupied for hours. They hauled me into the hallway, past the nurses who were too busy or too scared to look up. They threw me into the elevator, the doors closing on the image of Merrick Vance leaning over my daughter like a vulture. When the elevator hit the ground floor, they didn't take me to the lobby. They took me out the service exit, the same one I'd used to chase Silas. They threw me onto the cold pavement of the alleyway, my knees scraping against the grit. Don't come back, Arthur, one of the men said, his voice devoid of emotion. You don't exist anymore. The SUVs roared to life and pulled away, leaving me alone in the dark, smelling of hospital trash and old rain. I sat there for a long time, my fingers digging into the asphalt. I thought about the rusted lathe in the basement. I thought about the first dollar I'd ever made. And then I thought about the one thing Merrick Vance had forgotten. He had forgotten that I didn't build Sterling Aerosystems with money. I built it with engineering. I reached into my shoe, the old, worn-out loafers I'd put on in a hurry. Hidden in the heel was a micro SD card. It wasn't a patent. It wasn't a bank account. It was the original diagnostic code for the Green Lane Logistics Network, a code I'd written myself in Mutngin Chintrum Tarmwe Tarm. The hard reset Julian had triggered hadn't just wiped the servers. It had activated a dormant protocol I'd buried in the system 30 years ago, something I called the black box. It was a backdoor that didn't rely on the internet or the corporate mainframe. It was a closed-loop system that only responded to a physical key. Merrick thought he was taking the physical assets, but without that code, the shipping containers wouldn't open. The planes wouldn't start. The Green Lane would turn into a dead end. He had the shell, but I still had the heart. I stood up, wincing as my joints popped. I wasn't the billionaire Arthur Sterling anymore. I was Arthur Sterling, the machinist from Queens. And I was going to build a new machine, one designed specifically to grind the Orion Group into dust. I walked out of the alleyway and toward the subway station. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a phone. but I had a memory of a small, dusty workshop in Brooklyn that I'd never sold a place Eleanor hadn't known about. I didn't know it yet, but the hidden truth about Eleanor wasn't the only secret Merrick was keeping. And as I stepped onto the R train, surrounded by the early morning commuters who didn't give me a second glance, I realized that to beat a ghost, you have to become one yourself. My revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be a courtroom drama or a headline in the Wall Street Journal. It would be a mechanical failure, a slow, systematic collapse of everything Merrick Vance valued. The first step? I needed to find Julian Vane, because if he was the man I thought he was, he hadn't just tied Vance's man to a chair. He'd probably started the timer on a bomb that was about to blow the Orion Group's Rotterdam connection wide open. I leaned my head against the cold window of the train. "I'm coming for you, Merrick," I whispered. And this time, I'm checking the pulse. The loop was open, the game had shifted, and the billionaire was officially dead. The engineer was just getting started. The R train smelled like damp wool and missed opportunities. I sat huddled in the corner of the car, my head down, watching the flickering fluorescent lights dance across the floor. To the tired barista across from me and the construction worker nodding off to my left. I was just another anonymous old man, at 5 in the morning, another gray ghost in a city that never stops to ask for your ID. They didn't see the man who had owned a penthouse overlooking Central Park. They didn't see the man who had built engines that powered the world's elite. I was Arthur Sterling, and for the first time in 40 years, I was invisible. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. I got off at the Smith 9th Street station in Brooklyn. The air here was saltier, thick with the scent of the Gowanus Canal and the rot of the old docks. I walked 6 blocks into Red Hook, my joints screaming with every step, until I reached a nondescript brick building with a rusted rolling shutter. It used to be a small tool and die shop, Sterling Machine Works. I'd bought it in Mutngin Chin Tree by Muitarm and never put it in the corporate books. Eleanor had called it my fortress of solitude, the one place where I wasn't a CEO, just a man with a lathe and a vision. I pulled a heavy iron key from the hidden pocket of my loafers, the same one that held the SD card. The shutter groaned as I lifted it, a sound that felt like the earth itself was protesting my return. Inside, the shop was exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago. The smell of cutting oil and cold steel hit me like a physical embrace. It was the smell of home. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I didn't want to alert anyone that the ghost was haunting his old workshop. Instead, I clicked on a single green-shaded lamp over the workbench. I reached into the back of a vintage Mutngin Chin Trum Tarmwilum filing cabinet and pulled out an old, air-gapped Panasonic Toughbook. It was a dinosaur by modern standards, but it was sturdy, unhackable, and it ran on the same base architecture I'd used to build the original Sterling logistics grid. I sat there for a moment, the yellowed letter Merrick Vance had given me sitting on the workbench. "Arthur, forgive me. The Orion debt must be paid." I looked at her handwriting again. It was Eleanor's, the elegant, sweeping loops of her L's and the sharp, decisive crosses of her C's. But as I stared at it under the lamp, something felt wrong. Eleanor was a woman of absolute precision. She had been the one to check my blueprints for errors when we were starting out. She had a habit when she was under pressure, a subtle tell. Whenever she was writing something she didn't believe in, she would double-cross her T's, just a tiny, second stroke, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Every single T in this letter was double-crossed. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a confession of a deal. It was a warning. She hadn't been paying Merrick a retainer to stay in the shadows. She had been paying for a paper trail. She had been feeding the wolf to keep it away from the door while she built a cage. She was smarter than both of us, wasn't she? I didn't jump. I recognized the voice. Julian Vane stepped out of the shadows by the welding station, his face half lit by the green lamp. He looked tired, his dark suit dusty, his eyes carrying the weight of the night's work. "Julian," I said, my voice rasping. "Status report. Vance Thorne is out on bail, Arthur. Merrick's lawyers moved faster than the FBI's paperwork. They've already filed a restraining order against you. If you step within 500 feet of the hospital or the estate, you're going back to a cell, and this time, it'll be a psychiatric ward." He walked over and leaned against the workbench, looking at the letter. "The man I tied up in your study? He talked before the feds took him. Merrick isn't just taking the physical assets. He's moving the Orion Group's crown jewel through the Green Lane tonight. A shipment of unregulated medical isotopes and black market lithium. It's worth upwards of $200 million. If that shipment clears customs in Rotterdam, the Orion Group will have enough liquidity to buy out the rest of Sterling's board and bury you forever." "He thinks the Green Lane is open," I said. a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. He's using the physical routing servers at the hangar, Julian said. He thinks because you did a hard reset, the system is back to factory defaults. He's already pushed the manifest through. The factory defaults include the black box protocol, Julian, I said, holding up the micro SD card. I wrote it as a failsafe back when Merrick first tried to take me down in Chin Muisar. I told him I'd check the pulse next time. Well, the pulse is about to flatline. I slotted the SD card into the toughbook. The screen flickered to life, lines of ancient, emerald green code scrolling past. This wasn't the slick, user-friendly interface Vance Thorne had seen. This was the raw, brutal machinery of the Sterling grid. The Orion shipment, I muttered, my fingers flying across the keys. Find vessel the Aurora Borealis. It's currently 300 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. I found it. A blinking white dot on a sea of digital black. To Merrick Vance, looking at his monitors at the Sterling estate, that dot was moving steadily toward Europe. But as I entered the black box override, I saw what he couldn't. I'm not just stopping the ship, Julian, I whispered. I'm ghosting it. I'm rerouting the GPS coordinates on the bridge, but I'm leaving the signal to the company satellites untouched. Merrick will see the ship in the middle of the Atlantic, while in reality, the automated steering is bringing it right back to a very specific pier in New York. Pier Mumbai, Julian said, his eyes widening. The one right next to the DEA's regional headquarters. Exactly, but that's only half of it. To make this stick, I need Vance Thorne to incriminate himself. He's out on bail, which means he's desperate. He's going to try to access the special logistics account one last time to secure his own exit strategy before Merrick realizes the shipment is diverted. He'll go to the estate, Julian said. He thinks you're gone. He thinks he's the king of the castle. Then let him walk into the throne room, I said. I looked at the screen. The black box was active. The Aurora Borealis was slowly beginning a massive, invisible turn. It was a mechanical betrayal, a slow-motion car wreck that Merrick Vance wouldn't even notice for another 12 hours. But as I felt the rush of the comeback, a notification popped up on the bottom of the screen. A remote access request. From the Kensington Medical Center. My breath caught. Sloan. I bypassed the hospital's security firewall in seconds. I wasn't looking for her vitals. I was looking for her room's internal log. A name had been entered into the visitor log 5 minutes ago. Dr. Silas Vane. He's back, I hissed, turning the laptop so Julian could see. Your brother didn't run, Julian. He went back to finish the job. Julian's face went white. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out his sidearm, checking the chamber with a lethal, rhythmic click. He's not going to hurt her, Arthur, Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He's going to use her. He knows she's the only leverage Merrick has left to keep you from using that black box. If Merrick realizes the ship is turning, he'll order Silas to terminate the asset. The room felt ice cold. I had a choice. I could stay here and ensure the Orion shipment hit the DEA pier, destroying Merrick's empire once and for all. Or I could leave and try to save my daughter, likely letting the ship slip back into the fog of the Atlantic. It was the same choice I'd had at the hospital. The company or the girl, the legacy or the blood. I looked at the green screen. I looked at the letter from Eleanor. And then I looked at the black box code. I realized that for the last 40 years, I'd been looking at engineering all wrong. You don't build a machine to do one thing. You build it to handle every variable. Julian, I said, my voice steady, go to the hospital. Get her out of there. Don't worry about Silas. If he's your brother, you do what you have to do, but get my daughter to safety. And what about you? Julian asked, heading for the door. Merrick will know you're here the second he tries to ping the ship's real coordinates. Let him know, I said, a dark, jagged laugh escaping my throat. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm going to the estate. I'm going to walk through the front door, and I'm going to sit in my wife's chair, and I'm going to wait for him. I didn't tell Julian the rest. I didn't tell him that the black box didn't just reroute ships. It was a terminal command. Once the Aurora Borealis hit the pier, it would trigger a global red alert on every Sterling Aero Systems shipping route in the world. Every plane would be grounded. Every ship would be locked. The Orion Group's entire international network would be paralyzed, frozen in a digital ice age. And I was the only one with the thaw code. I watched Julian disappear into the gray morning. I turned back to the workbench. I picked up a heavy, steel-toed boot and began to lace it up. I wasn't the billionaire. I wasn't the ghost. I was the architect of the collapse. I walked out of the shop and hailed a cab. Greenwich, I told the driver. The Sterling Estate. Big place, the driver said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. You work there? I looked out at the Brooklyn Bridge, the steel cables looking like harp strings in the dawn light. I used to, I said, but today, I'm just the man delivering the bill. What I didn't know yet was that Merrick Vance had already anticipated my move. As I pulled up to the iron gates of my home, I didn't see the gray-suited guards. I saw a single, black hearse parked in the driveway, and sitting on the hood waiting for me with a bottle of Eleanor's favorite champagne was Vance Thorne. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. "Welcome home, Arthur," he called out, his voice echoing through the silent estate. "We were just about to start the funeral. You're just in time to see who's in the casket." My blood ran cold. The hidden truth wasn't just about Eleanor's debt. It was about what she had been hiding inside the Sterling estate. A secret that would make the $84 million look like pocket change. I stepped out of the cab. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a team. I just had the black box in my pocket and the ghost of my wife at my back. "I'm not the one who's dying today, Vance," I said. But as I looked at the hearse, the back door slowly swung open. The back door of the hearse groaned as it swung wide, a heavy, mechanical sound that seemed to swallow the morning bird song. I braced myself, expecting the worst, expecting to see my daughter's pale face staring back at me from the silk-lined darkness. But as the interior light flickered on, I didn't see a body. I saw a mountain of blackened, twisted metal and scorched paper. It was the remains of my private office safe. Vance stepped off the hood of the car, the champagne bottle dangling from his fingertips. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and manic, the mask of the sophisticated venture capitalist completely shattered. He looked like a man who had been digging through a graveyard with his bare hands. "You really are a piece of work, Arthur," Vance said, his voice cracking as he gestured toward the wreckage in the hearse. "Your man, Julian, he didn't just empty the safe, he rigged it with a thermite charge. The second my locksmith cracked the final tumbler, the whole thing turned into a furnace. All the special logistics files, the Orion contracts, the Rotterdam manifests all gone. Just ash and slag." I stood my ground, the cold wind of the Greenwich morning biting through my thin shirt. "I told you, Vance. I built this company to be indestructible. If I can't have the truth, nobody gets the lies." Vance laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. He took a long swig of the champagne and then smashed the bottle against the hearse's bumper. "You think you're so smart. You think burning the paper saves you? Merrick is inside. He's not interested in paper anymore. He's interested in the digital keys. He knows you have the black box. He knows the Aurora Borealis has changed course." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive alcohol and cheap fear radiating off him. "You're going to walk into that house, Arthur. You're going to sit at that computer, and you're going to put that ship back on its path to Rotterdam. If you don't, Merrick has a very different kind of funeral planned. And this time, the casket won't be empty." "Where's my daughter, Vance?" I asked, my voice like a grindstone. "She's with Silas," he sneered. "And Silas is currently deciding whether she's more valuable as a hostage or as a message. It all depends on what you do in the next 10 minutes. I didn't say another word. I walked past him, my heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest. I walked up the stone steps of the Sterling estate, the home I'd shared with Eleanor for 30 years. Every brick, every window, every blade of grass had been paid for with the sweat of my brow and the precision of my mind. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. The front doors were standing open. I walked into the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Merrick Vance was sitting in Eleanor's favorite wingback chair by the fireplace. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. He had the weight of the Orion Group behind him, and he had my life's work in his pocket. "The prodigal engineer returns," Merrick said, not looking up from a small, leather-bound book he was holding. I recognized it instantly. It was Eleanor's private diary. "You know, Arthur, your wife was a much better writer than you ever were. She had a way of describing the rot in this house that was almost poetic." "Put that down, Merrick," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. "You aren't fit to touch her words." Merrick finally looked up. His pale eyes were devoid of any human heat. "She wrote about the Rotterdam night, Arthur. She wrote about how she found the blood on your coat. She wrote about how she realized her husband wasn't just a builder, but a man who would kill to protect his pride. She didn't make a deal with me because she was greedy. She made a deal because she was terrified of you." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. I looked at the man who had haunted my career, and for a second, the room seemed to spin. Was it true? Had Eleanor spent the last 20 years of our marriage looking at me through a lens of fear? Had the special logistics been a wall I built to keep her safe, or a cage I built to keep her silent? She knew you'd never stop, Merrick continued, standing up slowly. She knew you'd keep expanding, keep pushing the green lane, until it touched things that shouldn't be touched. She wanted out. She wanted a clean life for Sloan. She thought if she handed the company to me, the debt would be settled, and you could finally be the man she wanted you to be. But you couldn't let go, could you? He walked toward the desk in the corner of the room, the one where I'd sat for decades, dreaming of flight. The Aurora Borealis is currently 5 miles off the coast of New York. It's heading for Pier Muy. The DEA is already waiting. If that ship docks, Arthur, the Orion Group loses $200 million in capital, but you lose everything. I'll make sure the world knows that the Sterling legacy was built on the backs of smugglers. I'll make sure Sloan knows her father chose a moral victory over her life. He pointed to the laptop sitting on the desk. Change the coordinates. Now, send the ship back to the deep water where it belongs, and I'll give you back your daughter. We'll take the company. We'll take the money, and you can spend the rest of your days in this big, empty house, mourning the woman you never really knew. I looked at the computer. I looked at the green-shaded lamp. And then, I looked at the shadow of the man I had become. Merrick thought he had me. He thought he'd used Eleanor's memory to break the last of my resolve. You're right about one thing, Merrick, I said, walking over to the desk. I never knew when to stop. I sat down. My fingers touched the keys. I could feel the hum of the Sterling grid beneath my fingertips. It was a beautiful, complex machine, and I knew every gear, every circuit, every line of code. But you're wrong about Eleanor, I said. I opened the black box protocol, but I didn't enter the coordinates for Rotterdam. I didn't enter the coordinates for the deep water. I entered a command that hadn't been used since the system was built. What are you doing? Merrick asked, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. Eleanor didn't just write in that diary, Merrick, I said, my voice steady and cold. She was the one who helped me code the original logistics grid. She was the one who suggested the double cross on the T's. She didn't make a deal with you to hand over the company. She made a deal to lure you in. I hit the enter key. Suddenly, every screen in the room, Merrick's tablet, Vance's phone outside, the monitors in the hallway erupted into a blizzard of red text. The special logistics files weren't in the safe, Merrick, I said, standing up. They were the safe. The files you thought you were burning? Those were just the bait. The real evidence, the 20 years of Orion Group wire transfers, the shipping manifest for the medical isotopes, the recordings of your son-in-law discussing the Green Lane bypass, it was all stored in the one place you'd never think to look. Where? Merrick hissed. In the ship? I said. The Aurora Borealis isn't just carrying cargo, Merrick. It's carrying the server, the physical hard drives containing every bit of data on the Orion Group's operations. I moved them there 3 days ago, before the acquisition even closed. The hard reset I triggered didn't erase the data. It encrypted it and broadcast it to every federal agency in the tri-state area. Merrick's face went a sickly, ashen gray. The sound of sirens began to drift over the hills of Greenwich, not one or two, but a symphony of them, growing louder, closer, a mechanical tide rising to meet the house. The ship isn't docking at Pier Muy for the DEA, I said, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. It's docking there because it's a crime scene, and you just walked into the center of it. Merrick lunged for me, his hands reaching for my throat, but the front doors burst open. It wasn't the police, it was Julian Vane. He was covered in sweat and grime, his suit jacket torn, but he was holding Sloan in his arms. She was conscious, her eyes wide with terror but alive. Behind him stood Silas Vane, his hands bound with plastic zip tees, his face a mask of beaten, bloody defeat. She's safe, Arthur, Julian barked, his voice raw. Silas tried to move her, but he forgot who taught him how to handle a perimeter. I rushed to my daughter. I took her from Julian's arms, holding her so tightly I thought I might break her. She sobbed into my shoulder, a broken, rhythmic sound of relief. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. Vance," he said. "He said you were sick. He said you were going to ruin everything." "I know, baby," I said, stroking her hair. "I know. It's over now." Merrick Vance stood in the center of the foyer, surrounded by the ghosts of his own greed. He looked at his son-in-law, who was currently being tackled by FBI agents on the front lawn. He looked at his brother, Silas, who wouldn't even meet his eye. And then he looked at me. You've destroyed it all, Arthur, Merrick said, his voice a hollow whisper. The 84 million, the sterling name. The company. You're a pauper. No, Merrick, I said, looking him right in the eye as the federal agents flooded into the room, their weapons drawn. I'm an engineer. And I just finished the most important project of my life. They led Merrick away in handcuffs. They led Vance away. They even led Silas away, despite Julian's silent, pained expression as he watched his brother being loaded into a squad car. The house was finally quiet. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the wind through the oak trees and the steady, quiet breathing of my daughter. 6 months later, I stood on the sidewalk in Red Hook, outside the old Sterling Machine Works. The building was no longer rusted. It was painted a clean, industrial gray. The sign above the door didn't say Sterling Aero Systems. It said Sterling, Daughter Engineering. The 84 million was gone, swallowed by the legal fees, the audits, and the restructuring of the company's debts. We were no longer billionaires. We were a small-scale prototype shop, working on high-efficiency turbines for local energy grids. It was hard work. It was honest work. It was the kind of work that made your hands ache and your soul feel light. Sloane walked out of the shop, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a smear of grease on her cheek. She was holding a blueprint. Dad, she said, her eyes bright with the old passion I thought I'd lost forever. I think I found a way to increase the airflow on the Genborn intake. If we adjust the pitch of the blades by 2 degrees. I looked at her, and I saw Eleanor. I saw the future. I saw a legacy that wasn't built on green lanes or secret logistics, but on the simple, undeniable truth of a job well done. 2 degrees, huh? I said, taking the blueprint from her. Let's see the math. We walked back into the shop together. We weren't the richest people in New York, but as the rolling shutter clicked shut, I realized that I'd finally gotten exactly what I deserved. I had my mind, I had my daughter, and I had the peace that only comes when you finally stop running from the shadows. Money is a fleeting thing. It's just a number on a screen, a weight in a pocket. But integrity? Integrity is the engine that keeps you flying long after the fuel runs out. I looked at the rusted lathe in the corner, the one I'd never sold. I walked over and patted the cold steel. Check the pulse, Eleanor, I whispered to the quiet room. It's stronger than ever.